So yeah, just some quick housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded. Please reach out to me directly if you have any issues with this. Your microphone and camera will be off, and we will be using the chat function, I think, or the Q&A function. So the webinar, please do add your questions and comments. And if you have any technical issues, please do reach out to me directly. We also have interpretation today in French and Spanish, so please do follow the instructions on the screen. You can find the interpretation feature at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Thank you. Back to you, Pratik.
Thank you, Mel. I will now take us through the agenda of the webinar. Experts from the Ministry of Climate Resilience, Environment and Renewable Energy in Grenada, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, and UNEP WCMC will today present an overview of Grenada's National Ecosystem Assessment process. They will also highlight policy relevant recommendations as outlined in the Summary for Policymakers report. And finally, this webinar will also shed light on important insights, lessons learned, and best practices from Grenada's National Ecosystem Assessment experience. And these important insights and lessons learned that can be transferable and relevant for other ecosystem assessments at the Science Policy Practice interface. Before inviting our first speaker, I would like to provide a brief introduction of National Ecosystem Assessments. Next slide, please. National ecosystem assessments are a country-driven process. They are participatory and inclusive. They provide an up-to-date, comprehensive, and critical synthesis of knowledge on biodiversity and ecosystem services and their linkages to people. National ecosystem assessments address specific policy questions that are tailored as per country context. And finally, national ecosystem assessments help to close the gap of science, policy, and society. Next slide, please. Okay, our first speaker for today's webinar is Mrs. Arya St. Louis, who is the head of the Environment Division at the Ministry of Climate Resilience, Environment, and Renewable Energy in Grenada. Before I invite Mrs. Arya to deliver her opening remarks, I will briefly talk about her background. Mrs. Arya was one of the coordinating lead authors of Chapter 4 of the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment, which explores the valuation of the genetic and ecosystem resources of Grenada. She is currently head of the Environment Division at the Ministry of Climate Resilience, the Environment and Renewable Energy in Grenada, and is the CBT Technical Focal Point, IPCC Focal Point, and a climate negotiator for Grenada. Her research and interests lie in addressing the impacts of climate change on island biodiversity with emphasis on using ecosystem-based adaptation approaches for both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Her collaborations, including multidisciplinary research on commercially important fish species, endangered species, and habitat indicator species. Prior to the government of Grenada, she has worked in the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences at University of Florida and has been attached to Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources, DNA Profiling and Forensic Center in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. Mrs. Arya, welcome to this webinar. Thank you, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Tandon. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really delighted to be here and to bring some welcome remarks on behalf of the Permanent Secretary with responsibility for climate resilience, the environment, and renewable energy. So permit me at the outset to recognize the World Conservation Monitoring Center, WCMC, as implementing partner and the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI, as the executing partner for this milestone initiative. Permit me also to recognize and thank the German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection for the financial support of the global project through the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network, BESNet, who has also been instrumental in accomplishing this high-quality assessment. this morning I have the easy task first of just giving a few brief remarks and welcoming us all to this webinar where the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment will be examined, the best practices, next steps, capacity building opportunities, and robust partnerships will be unpacked. We are all aware globally as human societies that we are dependent on nature and the goods and services that are provided by nature. However, we have modified environment and damage and harm to nature has negatively affected our productivity and our economic, social. Over the last few decades, the world has witnessed catastrophic phenomena linked to biodiversity loss. Activities which increase degradation of forests, erosion and loss of our topsoils, and choices that result in habitat conversion and loss of biological diversity, indiscriminate littering and pollution, introduction of alien invasive species, and associated increased incidence of disease in economically important crops, climate impacts, and the list goes on and on. IPBES has well documented the list of drivers of biodiversity loss, which can and have affected food security, water availability, and other critical goods and services provided by nature. Our Caribbean islands have been identified as biodiversity hotspots with rich variety of ecosystems that underpin our livelihoods and economic prosperity for both traditional sectors like tourism and fisheries, as well as new and emerging areas like blue economy. However, more and more, Grenadians have become aware that our biodiversity resources are being impacted and eroded. Where are the wide variety of different fruit trees that we used to see in the countryside? What has happened to our dry forests in the coastal area? In order to tackle these challenges, a first critical step is to understand the current status of our biodiversity resources and the trends. We also need to predict future dynamic scenarios and answer key management questions. This is essential to guide policy and decision-making and to identify priorities for conservation and wise use of nature. Grenada's National Ecosystem Assessment aims to contribute to this store of knowledge. It gives a picture of the current state of knowledge and the existing gaps between the science policy interface. Grenada's NIA involved a cadre of local and regional experts as lead authors, contributing authors, and fellows. At this time, it is the first island to ever conduct a holistic document based on the conceptual and assessment frameworks of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. Technical support of the World Conservation Monitoring Center, including capacity building in such areas as scenarios, was essential to the successful completion of this document. The project coordinator from CANARI, in collaboration with us in Environment Division in the Government of Grenada, and with the support of a local project steering committee, steered this important process. And the findings of this assessment will now serve as an important input or important inputs to inform biodiversity-related policies, plans, budgets, regulations, and subsequent impacts to our societies. In this light, on behalf of the PS, I therefore would like to place on record our thanks to CANARI for the well-grounded effort to actively engage stakeholders during the assessment process, and to the WCMC for their technical assistance, and to the German Federal Ministry for their financial support. In closing, I encourage us all to read Grenada's NIA, the Summary for Policymakers and our Citizens Guide, and to participate fully in national activities and reach out, of course, to our Ministry of Environment as necessary. The useful recommendations coming out of this document, as well as the information to fill the necessary gaps now resides in our hands. In this way, and by use of this document and its recommendations, we can mainstream biodiversity and bend the curve of biodiversity loss within the next 6 years up to 2030, and then live in harmony with nature from 2030 onwards, even before the 2050 suggested theme and vision. Thank you again, and we look forward to a productive webinar. I thank you now, Mr. Tandon, and I turn back over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Arya, for your very important and significant opening remarks for this webinar. Our next speaker will be Dr. Thiago Ojeda, who is the head of policy at UNEP WCMC. Dr. Thiago oversees UNEP WCMC's work in international policy and conventions, nature indicators, gender, human rights, and national ecosystem assessments. Prior to UNEP WCMC, Dr. Thiago led the forest governance program at Chatham House, consulted for the IPCC on poverty and climate change mitigation, and also served as a senior civil servant at the Brazilian President's Office. Thiago's background includes a PhD in environmental policy from Imperial College London. Dr. Thiago, welcome to this webinar, and the floor is now yours now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introductions. Hi, everybody, and distinguished guest speakers. I'm very happy and honored to welcome you all to this webinar on behalf of UNEP WCMC, World Conservation Monitoring Center. Thank you for making the time to attend this webinar. As you know, 2023 and still ongoing this year has been a warmest cycle ever registered by a huge margin. And today we face multiple crises, of course, not only on biodiversity and climate, but also inequality, poverty, and hunger that we all need to address. We need policymakers across all levels and sectors to take urgent action on all of these matters through, of course, relevant policies that are underpinned by scientific and indigenous and local knowledges. Framework, which is also referred to as the biodiversity plan, the biodiversity plan, mending a relationship step, but ultimately the biodiversity plan will be judged on the strength of its implementation. And I do appreciate that national governments like the Grenada government and others around the world are working hard to turn commitments into concrete and positive outcomes for nature and people. I'm speaking from Cambridge in the UK today, and we at UNEP WCMC support countries all over the world through several initiatives, one of them being the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative, which we refer to as the NEA initiative. And through the initiative, we work on assessment, providing key information to policymakers to comply and deliver on environmental and development goals, including the biodiversity plan. Since its beginning, more than 15 years ago, the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative has supported 14 countries to undertake the assessments, which are, by the way, highly inclusive, participatory, encompassing participation of multiple stakeholders, including civil society, academics, indigenous peoples, and local communities. The assessments, or the NEA assessments, allow for meaningful exchanges between all of these stakeholders and the co-creation and joint construction of knowledge on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Our collective goal is to enrich decision-making and enhance the science policy interface on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And focused on today's webinar, it's very important to highlight Grenada as being proudly standing as the first small island developing nation to undertake a national ecosystem assessment utilizing the IPBES methodology. So well done. The National Ecosystem Assessment of Grenada has created a centralized repository of evidence on the nation's natural environment, shedding light on the indispensable environmental services that are integral to the well-being of people of Grenada and beyond. Today, with this webinar, we are focusing on the main findings and lessons learned from the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. It is expected that the country will now progress to the next stage of utilizing the assessment's findings to enrich policy making at the national, regional, and international level. I'm confident that the experiences and learnings from Grenada will inspire the development of ecosystem assessments in other countries and regions of the world. I'd like to congratulate and thank the Ministry of Climate Resilience, the Environment and Renewable Energy of Grenada, and the Caribbean Natural Resource Institute for their dedicated effort and commitment to develop the NEA of Grenada. And also, I'm sincerely grateful to the ICI, International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry of the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection for their financial support. And finally, thank you very much for the excellent contributions and collaboration with our partners UNDP and UNESCO from the Biodiversity in Ecosystem Services Network. Thank you very much. Our long-standing partnership has been instrumental for supporting countries in their own development of national ecosystem assessments. Thank you very much for this and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Thiago, for providing us with your very important opening remarks for this webinar. And now we will move on to the next speaker, which will be also our first session for the webinar that talks about overview of the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment process. This will be delivered by Ms. Aditi Tanu. Aditi was a contributing author to the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. She works as a technical officer at CANARI. Aditi has a background in biodiversity conservation and sustainable development within the Caribbean region. Her previous work has included research on the Eastern Caribbean region with a focus on the marine environment. She has also been involved in various environmental public awareness initiatives, which has built on her background as a teacher. She has worked both in the government and non-governmental sectors within the Trinidad and Tobago, giving her an appreciation for both policy development and advocacy initiatives. Aditi has a MSc in Biodiversity Conservation and Sustainable Development in the Caribbean from the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. Ms. Aditi, welcome to the webinar, and the floor is now yours.
Hi, thanks, Pratik, for that wonderful introduction. And hi, everyone. As Pratik said, my name is Aditi from CANARI, Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. I'm zooming in today from a not so sunny island of Trinidad, but happy to be providing an overview of the National Ecosystem Assessment Report of Grenada. Next slide, please. Yes, and following, yes, thank you very much. And just to provide some background to our organization, CANARI, it is a non-profit technical institute operating since 1989. So we have more than 30 years of experience in research, policy influence, and capacity building for participatory natural resource governance in the Caribbean region. And our aim at this organization is to promote and facilitate stakeholder participation and collaboration in the stewardship of natural resources within the region. Next slide, please. So to give a bit of background on this project, CANARI was invited by the government of Grenada to execute the NEA on behalf of the government of Grenada, because as a regional civil society organization, we highlight the importance of the participatory process. As mentioned, the project is part of the global initiative on supporting decision-making and building capacity to support the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, through national ecosystem assessments. And yes, funding, as mentioned as well, is through the government of Germany, ICI, and UNEP WCMC. Next slide, please. So in terms of our project methodology, we follow the method set up by IPBES, and we did adapt it significantly to local context. So we did tailor it a bit for our local context in Grenada. Next slide, please. Now coming to the main project outputs. So for the Grenada NEA, as we know, the main project output is the assessment report. And in the report, we have information on the status and threats to key ecosystems, the importance and value of ecosystems, as well as highlighting future scenarios and trade-offs for various development options. Now, this report is being developed to serve as a decision support tool. And as Mrs. St. Louis indicated, it acts as a science policy interface. Additionally, we have also recently published a summary for policymakers. Next slide, please. And I just want to go through some of the chapters we have in the Grenada NEA. So in total, we have about 6 chapters. So chapter 1 focuses on setting the scene and acts as the introduction chapter. Chapter 2 looks at status, trends, and threats to Grenada's ecosystems. And the ecosystems that we focused on in the NEA report were identified by local stakeholders during the consultations for the scoping reports. Chapter 3 speaks to the contribution of Grenada's ecosystems to climate resilience. And in this chapter, we have developed DPSIR models, drivers, pressure, state, impact, and response models, which have been used to illustrate in a simple way the dynamic nature of each ecosystem as they are impacted by climate change. Chapter 4, we provide information on the evaluation of genetic and ecosystem resources. Chapter 5 builds on the previous chapters and aims to develop identify suitable policy responses for the maximization of ecosystem services. And the final chapter describes various scenarios and pathways to a sustainable future. And also just want to give a huge thank you to all the coordinating lead authors and their hard work in each of these chapters. Next slide, please. So I just want to backtrack a bit to go back to understanding how the Grenada NEA was framed through our scoping process. So during the scoping process or scoping assessment, consultations were conducted with various stakeholders across Grenada to frame the actual Grenada NEA report. And that process included government consultations with key representatives to identify needs and engagement methods. Then 6 consultations were held across the 3 island states, targeting various local communities and stakeholders, inclusive of young persons. And at these consultations, priority ecosystems and ecosystem services were identified. And the scoping process was supplemented with desk research on status and trends of ecosystems, drivers of change, as well as any ecosystem information needs. Wider consultations were held with government agencies to identify priority policy and policy issues relevant to biodiversity and ecosystems. And these were matched to stakeholder priorities to develop the key policy questions. And finally, the scoping report was drafted, identifying key policy questions, identifying priority ecosystems, assessment methodology, and at the end of this process, we also included the production of a scoping video as well. And just to say that the scoping process, the key policy questions coming out of the scoping process frame the chapters that we developed in the Grenada NEA reports. Next slide, please. I just want to give you a quick overview of the process timeline. From 2019 to 2020 is when we launched the project. We got into the scoping consultations. We put out a call for authors and reviewers. We selected the coordinating lead authors. From 2021 to 2022, the chapter teams began to meet and develop the chapter structures, as well as we had data collection and development of our Zotero database. And during this period, our 0 order draft and first order draft were developed. And coming to the end of the process in 2023, we hit the ground running again. We developed the second order draft. We had a validation workshop to verify the information in the second order draft with local stakeholders. And we had the final draft submitted. The editing process, we went through that. And the Grenada NEA was published last year on launch last year in October 2023. And of course, we have the summary for policymakers that was published in 2024. Next slide, please. Now, I would just like to flag some key highlights and key processes coming out of the Grenada NEA project. So firstly, this was a mammoth data collection and collation effort. So we had multiple sources of data from 28 organizations at the local, regional, and international level, and included civil society, academia, and government agencies. We have developed a literature database with over 900 references. We also collected geospatial data to develop unique maps for this report. Next slide, please. We've also developed an author network with over 100 authors from 10 different countries. The final core team had 72 authors comprising of 14 coordinating lead authors, 38 lead authors, and 34 contributing authors and 7 fellows. And this was a multidisciplinary team of authors that was on and included economists, anthropologists, climate change specialists, biologists, and other natural resource management experts. So there was a lot of support within the author network with younger authors learning from more experienced authors. Next slide, please. And through the NEA process, advocacy tools and training opportunities were provided. So this included, we had a cell phone video competition that was used to raise awareness on Grenada's ecosystems utilizing information and communications technology, ICT. And during the project, training opportunities were actually provided for authors, policy, Grenada NEA stakeholders, and interested persons on ecosystem valuation and scenarios training. So for the ecosystem valuation training series, was provided on economic valuation, economics, nature's contribution to people, and for scenarios training, we provided an oversight of foresight scenarios and foresight scenarios, methods, and approaches. Next slide, please. And yes, again, flagging that our summary for policymakers has been published, and this summary extracts and packages the most relevant information from the NEA to assist policymakers in decision-making. And overall, the data and information in the NEA aims to empower all Grenadians to take action to influence international decision-making and to reduce biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Yes, and I just want to flag that the Grenada NEA has been highlighted internationally and regionally. So in 2022, the project was highlighted at the World Biodiversity Forum held in Switzerland. What was highlighted was a strong participatory approach utilized. In 2021, the Council of Ministers for Environmental Sustainability in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS, signaled their interest in NEAs at a virtual meeting. And following up from that, OECS representatives actually attended the regional workshop on ecosystem assessments for Eastern Caribbean states and the launch of the NEA, the Grenada NEA in October 2023. And there they discussed opportunities for ecosystem valuation data generation and national and regional ecosystem assessments. And coming to our final slide, I just want to say thanks to everyone involved in the process, to all our partners, stakeholders, the government of Grenada, our funders, co-chairs, authors, fellows, all contributors of local knowledge, reviewers, the communities, and civil society organizations. So I thank you very much, and I pass over back to Pratik.
Thank you, Ms. Aditi, for your very insightful presentation. I just wanted to mention that we have about 61 attendees for this webinar, and it's really nice to see everybody sharing where they're from in the chat box. And I would encourage other attendees to also please share about yourselves in the chat box. And if you also have any questions for our panelists, you may also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will be monitoring that during the course of the webinar. Oh, thank you. Moving on to the next session for today's webinar, which will be delivered by Dr. Natalie Boudram, who was the Grenada NEA project manager, and she's a senior technical officer at Canary. Dr. Natalie is an ecologist specializing in forest, river, and riparian ecology. She also has an extensive background in climate resilience, integrated water resources management, environmental health, and environmental education. Before joining Canary, Natalie worked at the Global Water Partnership Caribbean and the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute. Forests and rivers give Natalie great joy. So she is responsible for the Forest, Livelihoods, and Governance program at Canary, helping stakeholders protect and manage these critical natural resources. Natalie has a PhD in ecology, forestry, concentration. Dr. Natalie, thank you and welcome to this webinar.
Good morning, everyone,
The
and
floor
in
is yours.
particular, good morning to a number of our authors and local stakeholders from Grenada who have joined the webinar today. I haven't spoken to some of you since last year, so good to see that you all are still around and doing well, hopefully. Next slide, please. So as Pratik indicated, my task today is just to give an idea of some of the main findings of the Grenada NEA, and also to talk a little bit about lessons learned and best practices. So just to say that this webinar is for both the local Grenadian audience and our international audience. So some of our authors and local stakeholders will, of course, be very familiar with all of this information, but I am giving a bit of an overview to our colleagues from other countries who would be less familiar with Grenada and the findings of the NEA. I also will be talking a little bit about lessons learned and best practices that we've tried to employ during the Grenada NEA. There are lots of little process-oriented type lessons, I imagine, that if you all would like some information on how we handled different situations, etc., feel free to reach out to us as needed. But for today's presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on our participatory approaches in terms of best practices and lessons learned, and in particular, showcasing how we have created targeted products and done very targeted capacity building with a view to facilitate the science policy interface that we are seeking through the Grenada NEA process and through the NEA process overall across all countries that are implementing NEAs. Next slide. Okay, so Aditi just kindly turned her screen and showed me that I was not on video, which I now am. And I'm still not on video, but that's okay. We'll continue. Okay, so Grenada. As you've heard from Aria and others, Grenada was the first island and Caribbean country that conducted an NEA. And as would have been mentioned, Grenada is a tri-island state with Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. As we mentioned, it is a relatively small country, 344 square kilometers, and a population of 112,000 people or thereabouts. The economy is based on tourism and agriculture, and Grenada is known as the Spice Isle of the Caribbean. Next slide. And I think you all can see my, still no, that's okay. You're not missing anything. I don't know what's going on with my video. All right, so as Aditi would have mentioned, NEA chapters, for example, included an introductory chapter, and I think I see both coordinating lead authors for that chapter on this call. A lot of detail was provided in the second chapter, which talks about the status, trends, and threats to Grenada's ecosystems, and I'll highlight some key points from that. We did put a lot of emphasis on climate change, and that's demonstrated as well in the NEA. And then apart from a general valuation of ecosystem resources, Grenadian stakeholders wanted a very heavy emphasis on genetic resources. So that chapter that addressed the valuation of goods and services focused also very heavily on genetic resources in that country. And of course, we then, because we are looking at the science policy interface, we do have the sort of policy chapter, but it's really more about different pathways to support, enhance, and amplify ecosystem services for the economic and social well-being of Grenadians. And as Aditi would have also mentioned, we do have a chapter that focuses on scenario, basically alternative pathways for Grenada and what that might look like in about 2050. And I think we have Dr. Adrian Cashman, who is the author of that chapter, the coordinating lead author from that chapter as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, yes, Juanita, this is what your staff was up to in Grenada. Oh, actually, I think I saw Nora on the call as well. Yes, Nora, I'm selling out all your secrets. But to talk a little bit about Grenada's forest, freshwater, and agricultural ecosystems, what we noted in particular in that chapter on the status is that these ecosystems have changed, have undergone numerous changes due to natural and anthropogenic factors. The Grenada NEA actually included agriculture and agrosystems as one of the ecosystems that we targeted to research and present information on. And that is because these ecosystems still provide a very valuable habitat for both native and domesticated fauna. And we also included agrosystems, given how important agriculture is to the economy of Grenada. In terms of some key points, for example, Grenada's vegetation, forest vegetation, covers approximately 58% of its surface. Different forest types include dry scrub woodland, montane thicket, rainforest, depending on what classification scheme you use. Interestingly, Grenada being a volcanic island, a number of its freshwater systems include, for example, geothermal springs, and this picture is of a volcanic crater lake. So an important freshwater ecosystem in Grenada and also an important tourist site. Next slide. So the NEA also goes into detail on Grenada's coastal, deep ocean, and offshore ecosystems. And as per typical Caribbean ecosystems, we are dealing with beaches, mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reefs, and they collectively form an important complex supporting various stages of life for marine flora and fauna. What is important to note is that Grenada's open ocean and deep oceans are home to many species, including commercially important and valuable species, but this ecosystem is not well studied. Another important ecosystem is its offshore ecosystems. So apart from Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique, which are inhabited, Grenada has approximately 60 uninhabited islands and islets, keys, and rocks, which are key biodiversity areas, especially for bird colonies. Next slide. Of course, we did go into detail about the different threats that these ecosystems face, and what kind of rises to the top of the type of ecosystem threats that are being faced in Grenada is, of course, loss and degradation of habitat. For example, due to deforestation, development, often for tourism. Pollution is a key issue. The impacts of storms and hurricanes, especially future climate scenarios, is of grave concern in Grenada as well. Cultural, domestic, sewage, industrial pollutants are key concerns, as are basic solid waste, marine litter across the country, etc. And this impacts both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Diseases were noted as a key threat to our ecosystems as well, including disease outbreaks, for example, in coral reefs or among sea turtles. Invasive species are another key concern in Grenada, including sargassum, which is demonstrated in the photo to the right, and lionfish, mongoose, and livestock. Livestock is actually quite a bit of an issue. I know in Petit Martinique, for instance, right now, I think they're trying to implement a draft project to manage the impact of livestock native vegetation. Next slide. Mention, a lot of attention was paid to climate change in this assessment. And we note that with increasing air and sea surface temperatures, we are also dealing with things like changing rainfall patterns, sea level rise, more intense hurricanes, droughts, and floods. So just a few examples. I mean, this is, of course, very well documented in the chapter. Given changes in rainfall patterns and the likelihood of more intense droughts, for instance, we expect in Grenada the expansion of drought-tolerant, non-native and native edge species into forests, especially intact dry forest communities. So with the strange-looking tree on the right, that's something called the naked Indian or Bursera cimaruba. That's typical of dry forest. So this dry forest is very prone to the impacts of climate change, especially under future climate scenarios for Grenada. Some other impacts we expect from climate change on ecosystems include saltwater intrusion from sea level rise, which might increase the salinity, for example, in salt ponds, backwaters, and estuaries, which then would impact the fauna that currently inhabit those areas. So what we also expect, apart from the impact on the flora and fauna of Grenada, climate impacts, are expected to have economic shocks. And we also spent a lot of time looking at gender-specific impacts. And we noted, for example, that women are particularly vulnerable to these economic shocks. We also note that changes that human actions, which lead to changes in land use or hydrology or anything that impacts the ecosystem already, makes these ecosystems even more vulnerable to climate change. So if they're already stressed, climate change is just another layer on top of that. Next slide. So to get to the meat of the matter, looking at the value of these ecosystems and ecosystem services. So we note how critical biodiversity and ecosystem services are to the Grenadian economy, in particular as it pertains to food and water security. Apart from economy or included within economic concerns, food and water security, human health, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. And just a few snippets or a few facts and figures. We noted, for example, that Grenada's watersheds generate approximately 24 million US worth in terms of water supply, value in terms of water supplies. In terms of tourism, Grand Etang Lake, which I showed a picture of earlier, that generated a total revenue of almost $600,000 US in user fees and tours between 2016 and 2020. So apart from these more economic terms, we focused very, very heavily on nature's contributions to people within the Grenada NEA. And in particular, I just want to highlight that ecosystem products and services constitute an essential part of the Grenadian identity. Grenadians are proud to be the Spice Isle of the Caribbean. Yeah, next slide. So again, I did mention earlier that there was a heavy emphasis on genetic resources as requested by stakeholders. And this is because Grenadians recognize the diversity, genetic diversity of both its agricultural and other ecosystems is a significant asset. And it already generates significant income, but has the potential to generate much more. So an example would be the high quality cocoa and spice products, which are dependent on local varietal diversity, which is unique to Grenada. So Grenadians are very aware of this, and they want to especially do whatever they can to protect this genetic diversity that they have. So the NEA, for example, is when looking at different response options to protect this biodiversity, genetic diversity, focused heavily on things like being party to different protocols and multinational environmental agreements as frameworks which can offer a better mechanism to manage genetic stock and forge partnerships for transparent use and harvesting. Overall, Grenadian stakeholders are aware of the need to safeguard the country from biopiracy and illegal bioprospecting. Next slide. So I have not gone into a lot of detail on the scenarios, but to be frank, I think the most enjoyable chapter to read in the NEA is the scenarios chapter. It's a lovely case of, I would say, almost storytelling, you know, and I would encourage you to go and read that, the different scenarios that can happen based on what actions we take, whether we take actions right now to conserve and protect our resources, if we don't, if we adopt a more industrial model versus a more sustainable model. I encourage you to go and read that chapter. It's a good read. The NEA also focused heavily on response options. How do we go about conserving biodiversity and ecosystems, and how we maximize these ecosystem services? So that chapter describes different options for the different ecosystem types, including what sort of enabling options we put in place, whether it's policy, laws, institutions, governance, etc. What we also need to protect Grenada's biodiversity and ecosystem services are foundational responses. Do we have enough information? How do we generate and distribute this information, including indigenous and local knowledge? And also instrumental response options in terms of markets, incentives, technology, practices, etc. Next slide. Okay, so to switch gears a little bit to the lessons learned and best practices, as I said, I am emphasizing the participatory approach that we utilize. So we talk a lot about science policy interfaces. How do we influence policy? And I think everybody on this webinar knows that this is not an easy task. It's one thing to generate the information, but how do we get the information to the people who will use that information to effect the change that we need? And there are different pathways that can be utilized. And what CANARI is good at, and what we emphasize in this process, is trying to influence policy through civil society empowerment. And not only was civil society important in designing and executing the NEA, but what we've also done is created targeted information products and did specific capacity building to help civil society use this information to advocate, to communicate, to talk to the decision makers, to stand up in an EIA consultation and point to some facts and figures and say, no, we need that mangrove because it is worth X amount of dollars in terms of goods and services. So our route and our best practice to get that science policy interface working is through civil society. Next slide. So because we had this focus, CANARI actually went ahead and solicited additional funding. We hunted down funding from the GEF project. It's the GEF IW Eco project, which is currently wrapping up. And we implemented a smaller complementary project, which is on capacity building and knowledge products to enhance the use and uptake. And the idea is that a range of stakeholders can use the information from the 547-page document, but use it more efficiently through other products and other outputs rather than this very heavy, literally heavy and large academic document. Next slide. So what we did through this complementary project is that we worked with civil society to do different bits of training, including training on environmental communication, how to communicate information from the NEA. And we've actually even gone ahead and developed communication campaigns based on some of the information in the Grenada NEA, including around sustainable debushing. That's, for those of you who aren't familiar, when ministries or workers clear roadsides in Grenada, that's referred to as debushing. And stakeholders are very concerned that this is not done in the most sustainable manner. It's done in a way that leads to a lot of soil erosion. So we've actually created a communications campaign that we hope to implement soon to be able to sort of change these practices. We've also developed communication campaigns on the value of mangroves and mangroves conservation. So what we're hoping to do, I think one of the speakers mentioned the BestNet funding, which should be available to implement the findings of the NEA. We hope to use this once the government of Grenada wants to take this path to be able to implement some of these campaigns and associated capacity building. Next slide. A key output of that complementary project is the Citizens Guide to the Grenada NEA, which we're just about finalizing right now. But basically, we condensed, I wouldn't even say condensed, I would say we extracted and presented in a more user-friendly way the key information from the NEA report that civil society organizations, youth, and other stakeholders can use and share on. And we develop it in conjunction with the civil society stakeholders. Next slide. So as of now, just to invite everybody to the online launch. We'll be sending out links, including through WCMC. We hope to launch this citizen guide to the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment on June 28th. That's next week. And just to give you an idea of what the Citizens Guide looks like I said, we've sort of extracted the information, have it right there in very concrete, discrete bullet points, so you can pull out and utilize this information much more easily than combing through the 547-page document. It's either 47 or 74, one or the other, 547 or 574. Next slide. And as has been mentioned, this is the first time that we're actually showcasing the summary for policymakers, which I imagine Arya would go more into detail too. But just how we created targeted products for civil society, we tried very, very hard to make this something that would be used by the policymakers. So rather than just a summary of the main NEA document, we specifically focused on the chapter on maximizing ecosystem services. And we have the information laid out very, very clearly that if, for example, we are dealing with forest ecosystems, some of the options that we can consider to protect these resources and maximize services is, for example, revise this piece of legislation. We need to, for example, mainstream ecosystem services in the existing policies and legislations. We need to be able to do, for example, in terms of foundational response options, do citizen science and knowledge transfer. And in terms of instrumental policy, instrumental responses, we need to look at things like new tools like payments for ecosystem services, targeting private landowners, etc. So it's very, very succinct and it gets to the meat of the issue. These are the things, the very specific things that need to be considered in terms of a policy response or just general responses to protect this biodiversity and ecosystem services. Next slide. Okay, and that is it. So thank you for your time. And just to repeat what all my other colleagues have said, thank you so much to the funders, to WCMC, and to all our stakeholders and authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Netley, for your very comprehensive and very important presentation in the context of this webinar. And moving on to our next session now, which will be on weaving indigenous and local knowledge in the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. This session will be delivered by Mr. Hayden Redhead, who was the external reviewer, local knowledge contributor, and civil society representative for the Grenada NEA. Hayden has been an activist for the environment and the protection of biodiversity for more than 30 years. During this time, he has amassed considerable experience in many fields, including ecosystem services, invasive alien species, Grenada's freshwater aquatic species, marine pollution, composting, and the identification, uses, and preservation of wild medicinal and aromatic herbs. Hayden organized and led the first and only climate strike in Grenada and is an outspoken advocate for both increased education and enforcement measures to control pollution and the breaking of laws related to the protection of the environment and biodiversity. Mr. Hayden, welcome to the webinar. Thank you again, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Pratik. And I just would like to say I'm so pleased to see the diversity of the persons participating in today's webinar. My presentation will be on weaving Indigenous and local knowledge into the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. Next slide. Indigenous and local knowledge in the Grenada context. While Grenada's history and heritage includes Indigenous persons, Grenada has not maintained a significant presence of Indigenous persons or Indigenous traditions. However, local and traditional knowledge is very valued and has been incorporated into the National Ecosystem Assessment for Grenada in keeping with a strong participatory approach of the Grenada NEA process. Next slide. The Grenada NEA was executed using a strong participatory approach that saw stakeholders being involved in the development of the assessment through inclusive and participatory processes. My compliments to CANARI because I was involved from quite early in the process, and it included, as I believe it was Natalie mentioned, going out into the actual communities and hosting meetings, meeting all levels of persons from older persons to youth, women, persons with disabilities. Everybody was included. Stakeholders were able to easily and efficiently input data through the collection of data at these meetings and with surveys. They were able to easily access, understand, and utilize the findings and products for decision-making and advocacy, and stakeholders were able to promote and use the Grenada NEA outputs and methodologies locally, nationally, and regionally. And as Natalie has just expounded, there are several tools being developed now to assist with the use of the outputs. Next slide. It was always important to include local perspectives and key civil society voices. The NEA process provided common spaces for academics and civil society to share information, and all were invited to the various training sessions and meetings. I can attest, and as I said, there was always a wide, rich diversity of persons. Civil society members were engaged as authors and contributors on local knowledge and credited as such in the NEA document. There was also a civil society co-chair to the NEA process, being Ms. Sandra Ferguson, in addition to the academic co-chairs. Next slide. It was important to incorporate local knowledge in the scoping report. Civil society was actually the first group who provided input into design of the Grenada NEA. And there was a broad cross-section of civil society, NGOs, youth, citizen scientists consulted during the scoping stage. An important step was a cell phone video competition conducted during the scoping stage. The competition supported the gathering of local knowledge, engaging local persons to identify priority ecosystems and services for inclusion in the NEA process. I can attest again here that there was a rich diversity of submissions under the video competition that saw many different ecosystems and ecosystem services highlighted. Next slide. Incorporating local knowledge in the Grenada NEA report, as it's summarized, ILK was embedded throughout the process. And for every draft of the NEA that was developed, local civil society stakeholders were given the opportunity to review and be included as external reviewers. Next slide. At the second order draft workshop, the chapter summaries and key points were presented to local stakeholders. This was done through several breakout groups and they gathered additional information. The feedback from those stakeholders was then included as a local knowledge section at the end of several chapters. For example, Chapter 2 included species threats, areas of concern and data gaps. Chapter 3, the recommendations to improve climate resilience of ecosystems. And Chapter 4, as we highlighted the importance, genetic resources most valued by stakeholders their potential uses, and the emerging opportunities of those genetic resources. Next slide. Local knowledge was captured during the NEA Scenarios Workshop, and the civil society representatives identified services drivers and trends that supported the scenarios development. Post-workshop surveys engaged participants to help frame the scenarios. The perception of ecosystem and ecosystem services in Grenada online survey that was conducted, the information was used to inform chapters 3 and 4. Collected local knowledge on the importance of ecosystems and ecosystem services, the threats to ecosystems, climate change concerns, as well as cultural and social value of different species. That was particularly important to the NEA because it was not the first time, but it was a unique experience to try to value all these local ecosystems and this ecosystem services that were provided to the Grenadians and visitors. Next slide. A strong participatory approach, as was mentioned, was used to incorporate local knowledge into the NEA report. Chapter 4 captured on-the-ground information through interviews with key persons, groups, and agencies on the economic values of various natural resources. So, for example, it was mentioned, but I'll say again that while we don't have a strong indigenous, we do have the local knowledge. So you're talking about the uses of our local animals as food sources, local plants as medicinal, and in culinary, in our culinary traditions. Next slide. To say thanks, but I also wanted to just highlight the main takeaways, that being the diversity of the participation, ensuring that local knowledge was collected through civil society and other local stakeholder groups, and a participatory approach, creating an environment for the engagement and input from all stakeholders. Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Hayden, for your excellent presentation. And we will now move to our final session of the day, which will be about highlighting policy-relevant recommendations as outlined in the Summary for Policymakers report. And this session will be delivered by Mrs. Arya, and I've already provided her introduction and background to everybody. So, Mrs. Arya, thank you again, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Tandon. And again, I'm delighted to be here and to share a little bit about the use of the NEA findings in the Grenada context. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I will provide one or two specific things building upon the very strong context of the prior speakers, a little bit about national level entry points and the activities that have taken place there, the sectoral level entry points and some subnational entry points, and then some bonuses that we saw as we move through the process of utilizing and mining this rich document for critical information to help mainstream. Next slide, please. So the NEA findings ideally were to be used for decision-making and to inform policy processes, primarily for mainstreaming. So right at the outset, I wanted to highlight that mainstreaming is critical, and it is identified as the process of embedding biodiversity and ecosystem service considerations into our policies, into our strategies and practices of key actors that impact or rely on biodiversity so that it is conserved and sustainably used. And that's from the Global Environment Facility 2016. The issue for us is how to mainstream. How do we actually do this? We want to address policy questions. We want to evaluate knowledge. We want to identify priorities. We want to disseminate information to our ministers and to our policymakers. And we want to make sure that we are strengthening the science policy interface. Therefore, entry points become particularly important for us. And so here I've also highlighted that entry points are really windows of opportunity to influence decision-making. These can occur across all levels of government and policy processes. And they are relevant to policymakers, they are relevant to the key stakeholders, they are relevant to the broader public on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So now to the juicy stuff. I will be speaking at 3 levels. So the level of entry points where I'm going to elaborate include 1, at the national level, secondly, at the sectoral level, and then thirdly, a little bit about subnational level. Next slide, please. At the national level, of course, during the 4 years of the preparation of this document, the zero order draft, the first order draft, there were opportunities to start to think and to align opportunities to inform and cross-pollinate some of the critical documents that Grenada was currently working on. These include national level documents related to environment policies, and this includes, for example, our National Environment Management Strategy, which is currently being updated and which is benefiting tremendously from the work and the recommendations that have already been tabled under our National Ecosystem Assessment. I also highlight to you that Grenada recently signed and ratified the Escazú Convention. It's an important regional convention that speaks to public access to environment information. So having spent significant time, because it took us about 3 months prior to the real start with the authors to amass the data sets and to run after the various publications, and we collated all this information into Zotero. So we had one central location where we could actually have reference material that was relevant to Grenada specifically, and also key primary data sets that through data sharing agreements had been released for use by our National Ecosystem Assessment. And this is really critical because for this particular convention, Escazú, which deals with public access to environment information, we now have the foundation that can be used to disseminate this information and to build upon that database and the information there. We also have a draft environment management bill, which is an overarching document that speaks to environmental protection and has space to bring into domestic legislation a lot of the multilateral environmental agreements. And again, benefits tremendously, in particular because the science policy platform that Grenada used, Sustainable Development Council, was strengthened through this process of the preparation of the National Ecosystem Assessment and included in our draft management bill and enshrined in that bill. So once we pass this important piece of legislation, again, we can see where the cross-pollination and the information coming out of the NEA and the process that the NEA involved being important parts of environment policy documents that are currently now being finalized and prepared. With respect to climate-related policy that is currently being finalized, I'm really delighted to say that Grenada is updating its National Adaptation Plan. We used the robust process that we did use in 2015, 2016, when we were first embarking on the journey of the preparation of a National Adaptation Plan. And its preparation started somewhere around 2020, yes, right around when COVID and all the dramas started to unfold for us in Grenada around COVID. But the point was that even at that time, it was recognized that there was so much useful information, particularly because adaptation policies and adaptation plans and adaptation actions within the Tri-Island state support ecosystem-based adaptation. And in that light, ecosystems play a critical role, and biodiversity, therefore, is really important in the update of our National Adaptation Plan. We've now reached close to the end of that document, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. We are in the process of updating our draft climate change policy, and also updating our nationally determined contribution. And here again, I want to flag and highlight that people may think, I mean, in the context of Grenada, we clearly continue to separate adaptation and to prioritize that as critical to us. Our NDC focuses more on mitigation action, but even within that, we focus on the electricity sector, we focus on the transport sector and reducing emissions there. We focus on the waste sector, but we also focus on forestry and other land use practices. And this is the area where, again, the recommendations from the National Ecosystem Assessment, the current status of forested areas and so plays a critical role as we update our nationally determined contributions, and not just our forests on land, but also our marine seagrass beds, again, shown to be very important in terms of carbon capture and storage. In addition, with respect to biodiversity-related policies that are currently under review, I'm delighted to say that with early action support, Grenada is now embarking on the process and really unpacking the update of our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. This is in follow-up to Grenada participating actively in the preparation and at COP, Biodiversity COP in 2022, tabling and agreeing on the Global Biodiversity Framework. So now we are aligning our national document to that document, identifying our national targets, and again, finding the value that comes out of the chapters and the critical recommendations from various chapters, including the one on the value of genetic resources and the value of ecosystems, to inform and update our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and to help us with the robust identification of our targets, and then to unpack the discussions around our indicators to measure progress. I finally want to highlight at the national level the coastal zone related policies, which are currently being finalized and which have benefited from robust pollination and overlap as we went through the successive stages. This includes our draft national ocean policy, our marine spatial plan, our coastal master plan, and species of special concern. Now, the first three, Environment and Fisheries Division, worked very closely on under our Blue Economy thrust, and Grenada since 2016 has led the way with respect to blue economy. But again, we built and want to have a very robust process, and the NIA was really instrumental in updating some of these outdated documents and ensuring that we now have the opportunity to have the kind of cross-pollination that Mr. Redhead spoke about. I also want to highlight the species of special concern, because when we passed our coastal zone legislation or Integrated Coastal Zone Management Act, the space was made for a schedule that brings into domestic legislation IUCN listed species of special concern, so that we can start to collect data on species who we don't have any information on and therefore need to know and understand the status, as well as species that we observe seem to be in decline. And so I'm really delighted to say that this was drafted, and we are now in the process of discussing and finalizing this with the Ministry of Legal Affairs. And for Grenada, that will be a big deal for us to have our own list of species of special concern, again, based on and built out of the second chapter of Grenada's National Ecosystem Assessment. Next slide, please. So we addressed the national level, but at the sectoral level, I also wanted to highlight the sectoral opportunities for robust justification of proposals, for the update of sectoral policies and plans. And here I wanted to spend a little time focusing on our multilateral environmental agreements and the support that the National Ecosystem Assessment provided in updating this. Firstly, I have to say that Minister James, who is our minister with responsibility for environment within the ministry, and she's actually responsible for climate resilience, the environment, and renewable energy, is a very strong advocate of the National Ecosystem Assessment. She brought the document to Cabinet, and it was very well received there, and she remains a strong advocate and proponent of the importance of nature and its consideration. It's important to people. In addition to her advocacy work and her willingness to include important quotes from the National Ecosystem Assessment in her national addresses and in her negotiations, Grenada has long signed, since 2012, the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. It is the third in the three pillars under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And after a time, perhaps I think that we were waiting to have the wonderful chapter which specifically unpacks the value of genetic resources and the value of ecosystems to help strengthen the draft Nagoya policy that Grenada is currently updating, and we hope to be able to table in cabinet. And that will help us to complete our ratification process for this third pillar of the convention. I already spoke a little bit about the importance of public access to environment information and how the NIA initially, through robust databases and the support provided there, already handed over to the government of Grenada a really useful resource for us to organize and then allow for dissemination of critical information. But in addition, Environment Division, working along with statistics, has produced an environment compendium that was released in 2023. This then we are now building upon for a full state of the environment report. And you can see where the findings of the NIA, particularly Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, would play a critical role as we move forward with the implementation of the Escazú Convention and the preparation of our State of the Environment report. Currently, we are actually at the stage of starting to plan out the roadmap. So between now and December, we will be engaging our stakeholders to understand what would be important in the context of Escazú. And through that process, we will be looking at how to incorporate the findings of the NIA into some of the critical documents needed as part of the ongoing implementation of Escazú. In addition, key information for use with the Ramsar Convention, Forest Forum, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and other conventions in terms of their reporting obligations were pulled out of the NIA document. I want to highlight just quickly that we had updated lists of genetic resources and also updated list of endemic species. And these are examples of things that happened, that were collated, that were immediately pulled by focal points from multilateral environmental agreements and utilized to update key information in compliance with obligations. I now want to turn for 2 minutes and just talk a little bit about the updated data for use in decision-making. And here, a big part was the work that the cartographer did in order to help visualize a lot of the information in the maps. And so updated freshwater coverages, for example, with the completed names of our rivers was something that we were really grateful for, and the work that was done on that. Updated area data for Parks and Protected Areas Network, which is of course very much linked to Target 3 under the Global Biodiversity Framework. And improved cartography of the sargassum maps. And here this is to improve understanding of where we see a lot of sargassum. So again, I'm giving you some practical examples of where the data captured in the NIA has already been utilized and shared with other ministries and agencies to inform and improve their data use and availability to inform policy and decision-making on the fly. I will make one small statement to say that we have delightedly welcomed an increased academic institutional interest to partner with us. I think many of the lead authors expressed interest, and some have actually visited Grenada. So they were looking at their universities, working along with the government of Grenada and strengthening the partnerships in order to set up permanent sites for quadrants, transects to help with the monitoring and evaluation under the Convention on Biological Diversity, but building off of the data that was already collated and shared through the National Ecosystem Assessment. I do want to give a quick highlight to the environmental and social reportings, because the government of Grenada has now prepared a draft government environment and social safeguards policy, and draft administrative guidance for environment and social impact assessments. Both of these documents benefited tremendously from work that was carried out under the National Ecosystem Assessment and built upon the interviews, the focus group discussions that took place under as these chapters were being prepared. Next slide, please. Finally, at the subnational level, with respect to private sector and local community groups, we should be going to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you so much. We had interest of the tourism sector, particularly for the update of scripts that are used routinely by our tour operators. And so we have reached out through the Ministry with responsibility for tourism and the GTA to unpack discussions about how to align and update critical information about ecosystems into tour guides who generate livelihood from this important sector for us. I also want to highlight the Nutmeg and Cocoa Association, who through the guidance of Senator Roderick St. Clair, have been looking at the rebranding of nutmeg and cocoa in the context of carbon capture and storage ability, and provided to us as part of the NEA critical information that we were then able to incorporate in, and hopefully as a result, they will be able to build on even further with respect to, and again, this is another non-government local industry who is benefiting from the National Ecosystem Assessment research, but also had dialogue as an important stakeholder with us and raised their interest in the rebranding of two of our major agricultural products, nutmeg and cocoa. I also want to highlight that the NEA has been used for site-level monitoring of the Ramsar wetland site and is an important tool for advocacy used to lobby local members of parliament, local MPs, on environmental issues. Next slide. So in summary, I want to highlight that we have benefited tremendously, and I think that there's a lot to be mined from this rich document and from the summary for policymakers that came from it. An unexpected but very positive and welcome benefit came from the fact that at the level of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, when Grenada shared and presented on our efforts under the National Ecosystem Assessment, we found a lot of traction at the regional level. And as a result, in the follow-up trenches, there are other islands. The Dominican Republic is one, but particularly among the OECS countries, there was a charge given for OECS member states, all 10, indicated that they would be interested in conducting national ecosystem assessments using the IPBES methodology and building off of Grenada's leadership in this area. So at a regional level, influencing the mainstreaming of biodiversity and the synergies with other multilateral environmental agreements, we felt really delighted to see the interest and the uptake with respect to the other islands wanting to undertake national ecosystem assessments as part of mainstreaming activities based on the importance and priority they wanted to give to biodiversity. For next steps, I just want to highlight the integration into the Ministry of Finance's budget labeling and budget planning processes, and this is extremely important to us in environment to make sure that the value of nature and the value of our resources now is taken into consideration as we do the budget planning process. Updating our systems plan for parks and protected areas and updating the associated management plans for these areas, and with respect to our links to circular economy. This is the year when there's a huge amount of emphasis looking at plastics compliance and reduction of plastics getting into the marine environment, and there are clear recommendations on this. I think that Dr. Boodram touched on one or two of those. So for our communications strategy, we have seen downstream use. We focused on a deep bushing program and mangrove restoration. With respect to the stakeholder mapping and engagement, we have benefited from the NEA because in a robust manner, we now have engaged multiple stakeholders and been able to bring them to the table in the context of biodiversity. And as I always like to say, biodiversity is the cake. Climate is creating some problems for the cake, but we are hugely dependent upon biodiversity, and this is improving it. Our scoping report and the key policy questions that we address there have identified important gaps for environment along with other partners to work closely along. And the technical report and the summary for policymakers were well received by Cabinet and are currently, as you see, being integrated at a national level, at a sectoral level, and at a subnational level. Our national biodiversity platform has been greatly strengthened. So we started out with the Sustainable Development Council, which addresses issues of importance for sustainable development and is very closely linked in the Grenada Tri-Island State context to management of nature, management of biodiversity and our ecosystem and the goods and services that they provide. And this important platform has been strengthened tremendously through the policy science interface that NIA presented and offered an opportunity for. Permit me, as we close, so next slide, please, to highlight a special acknowledgement to Dr. Spencer Thomas, who has been our IPBES focal point for many years and indeed was responsible right at the start for the negotiation of this project when I was merely a fledgling in this process. To Dr. Natalie Boodram, to Aditi, and also to Dr. Nicole, again, because Grenada's NIA strayed from the usual path of working along with a typical academic institution at the level of Environment Division, we chose to utilize a different approach, and we were very grateful to CANARI for being so receptive when we reached out to ask them if they would be willing to partner with us, and this has come to fruition. I want to recognize Dr. Claire Brown and WCMC, Juanita Chavez, Noor, Carla, and the hardworking team who we have met on multiple occasions in this process, former Permanent Secretary Prudence, and the Cameroon delegation for their excellent work and support. And through the networking at Cambridge University, we got to hear and answer many questions with them, as well as with the Colombian delegation. I also want to send a special thanks to the cadre of young scientists who readily gave of their time. We now have a much larger database of young scientists who can be our focal points for the multilateral environmental agreements in Grenada and support implementation action on island. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Arya, for your very important session and very comprehensive. I think that was very insightful. And we will now quickly move to the question and answer session for today's webinar. And I want to first of all thank all the attendees for already very proactively asking their questions, which have been answered in live by our panelists. So a lot of questions have already been answered. However, I would request if any of the attendees have any questions, you can ask now, and our panelists will be happy to answer them. Although we will be only allocating about 5 minutes for the question and answer session before moving to the final closing remarks of today's webinar. So we have a question from one of the attendees, and perhaps Natalie, you can also deliver the answer for the information of all attendees. So the question is about how can the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment serve as a model for a regional ecosystem assessment? So perhaps Dr. Natalie, you can answer
Actually, it already has. So when we launched the Grenada NEA in October last year, we incorporated a regional workshop with CARICOM and OECS stakeholders. So that's the Caribbean Community and Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, to basically highlight what was done in Grenada and to possibly serve as a model for other countries. Also to flag that CANARI also does a lot of policy work and drafting of regional and national policies and strategies. And we had also drafted the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Biodiversity and Ecosystem Framework. And that framework actually makes reference to the Grenada NEA and incorporating lessons learned, etc., from that into additional NEAs to be conducted, hopefully across other Caribbean countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Natalie. And we have one more question from Vame Hambira, one of the attendees. And the question is, what strategy did you use to set milestones towards the first draft such that no chapter lagged behind?
So I think my colleague Aditi was saying we could suggest that it was a dynamic process. Basically, we do have a large team of authors doing this on volunteer time. And of course, work, their jobs, their personal situations, etc., especially during COVID, did come into play. And yes, we did have situations of chapters lagging behind. What Aditi just reminded me, in cases where there was some lagging, we encourage chapters to share information with each other informally, even if the chapter itself wasn't finished, so that one chapter could be informed by another. But there are no guarantees, and we have to be cognizant of people's timelines and their other commitments. So this is a challenge, and I imagine it's a challenge for any country undertaking an NEA. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Natalie. So we have time for two more questions. And one question is from Chris Tevis about when was the figure of 58% of Grenada's surface covered by forest vegetation established?
Check the document. I'll have to go back to look at it. Yeah.
Okay.
The reference would be in the document.
Okay. And the final question would be from an anonymous attendee. Does the team think that there would be benefit from bringing this work to the attention of Inter-American Development Bank and CBD?
Yes, definitely. Valuation has been flagged as a priority, ecosystem valuation, a priority for the Caribbean region in several of the regional frameworks. And therefore, funding to move forward, including from all possible parties like the Inter-American Development Bank, etc., should be pursued. So definitely.
Thank you. And with that, we will close the question and answer session. For any additional questions, please feel free to contact UNEP WCMC's events team or myself as well, and we will be happy to forward your questions to the team in Grenada. And we will now move to the closing remarks for today's webinar, which will be delivered by Ms. Juanita Chavez. She is the Senior Program Officer at UNEP WCMC. Juanita is the project lead for the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative and is responsible for the overall management and delivery of the project. Her background includes a master's degree in natural resources law. Prior to UNEP WCMC, Juanita participated in the National Ecosystem Assessment of Colombia, as well as coordinating the fast-track assessment for the Amazon region. Juanita, welcome to the webinar, and the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratik, and thank you for the amazing presentations. We are very happy to be part of this celebration of so much work and commitment from all the experts that have participated in the assessment of Grenada, from the nature and natural science and social backgrounds. And we are also, in this case, thankful as well that you, the Grenada government, chose UNEP WCMC to be part of this journey. Because in these 5 years of working together, we have also learned so much from Grenada, from the team, and from the process. I would also like to recall how inspirational and interesting was to hear how the National Ecosystem Assessment findings have already provided so much support at national level to respond to international commitments from the different conventions on biodiversity, on climate change, and others. and also from just to hear as well how you have been using the assessment findings for all the policy and decision-making processes at national and subnational level. And this had been possible because the assessment itself not only was dealing with issues on biodiversity from the environmental perspective, but you showed very clear how the assessment was also visualizing these linkages between the different global challenges that we are facing globally, being the biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. So that's great. And also the importance of the assessment in bringing different considerations. For example, the gender consideration, also how it made use of different sources of data and knowledge, and bringing the local knowledge as one of those specific knowledge systems that should also have a space in providing this information as basis of decision-making processes. It also was very interesting to hear how the assessment was a mechanism to be innovative in the way we usually develop assessments, and also how to engage the different stakeholders. And this is something that perhaps other countries and assessment processes could learn from Grenada, which was excellent as well. As during the presentation was also mentioned, through the assessment process, you also strengthened and established this broader network of experts from different organizations, institutions, and even people working in other countries. But also being part of the NEA initiative, you are as well part of this community of practice, and having a platform that allows you to exchange your experience and also learn from the experiences of others. So this is absolutely amazing. And we are happy to also say that also we have the Regional Ecosystem Assessment Network, which also brings further champions and people involved in ecosystem assessments as part of this huge and global network that is again available. We are also very pleased to see that the assessment not only provides this valuable information, existing information and knowledge of the status and trends of biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also as a very important part of it, the identification of knowledge gaps. And we encourage and hope that from now until in the future, you will be using those that information on gaps to really address additional projects and try to fill that information, those information gaps that were identified. Also to invite as well other countries that may be interested in developing their ecosystem assessments to reach out. We really encourage countries to develop these assessments as a very good process, as we were mentioning, to also fulfill with international obligations within the different frameworks and conventions, but also to have more certain and informed and legitimate decisions and policies in place. So before we go, maybe this is not the end of the process, maybe the end of a project, but it's a starting point on a process that we aim have real impacts and that contributes to the better status and conservation of biodiversity in Grenada, but also for the well-being of the people in Grenada and overall. I would like once again to encourage everyone here in this webinar to join this Global Assessment Network so you can keep update on our coming events. You can find the link hopefully in the chat. And I'd like to invite everyone to visit our website, www.ecosystems.assessment.org, to learn more about the NEA initiative, to have a look to the different documents that were produced under the ecosystem assessment in Grenada. And with this, just thank you again very much for your attendance and wish you a very good rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanita, for your excellent closing remarks. And in closing, I would like to thank all the panelists and attendees for attending this webinar today. We hope that it was truly insightful for you. And finally, as Juanita mentioned, we invite all the attendees to please join our Subglobal Assessment Network community, which is a community of practice that connects and supports individuals and organizations involved in subglobal ecosystem assessments. So please scan the QR code to join the network and stay up to date with upcoming events. Thank you, everybody. And we've left our email addresses in the chat for further questions. Please feel free to contact us. Thank you all. Thank you.